Do you want it on?
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah. If you want to change it, there's a switch on the back, right? The gray one. So if the green light's on, it's on. Yeah, is the stream?
Hello, everyone. Everyone, wait, start to take your seat.
Yes, ma'am. There's another entrance.
On the side, this side, and
On
then go
that
up.
side. Hi, Earl. Nice to meet you. Welcome. So I guess I should turn this on, right? Or no?
You're 202. Close to new mission. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get ready to get started. So settle into your seats and make yourself at home tight with your neighbors. It's great to see such a terrific turnout. So the squishiness is worth it. So first of all, welcome and good afternoon. I'm Tabby Chavis, and I'm the director of our National Center for Institutional Diversity. We're delighted to be hosting this event in collaboration with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Office of Academic Innovation, and the Alumni Association at U of M during the annual campus-wide diversity summit. Before we begin, I wanted to start by acknowledging that many people on our campus and our local county, state, and national communities are celebrating and acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I want to start by honoring and acknowledging that occasion. Today's event, Social Transformation Through Public Engagement, brings together two presidential initiatives, Public Engagement and Impact, and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Indeed, we're honored to have President Mark Schlissel joining us today, as well as Robert Sellers, UM's Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. In planning this event, our team took advantage of opportunities to engage colleagues from across campus in some really good and really real conversations about both public engagement and DE&I. These conversations form the foundation of this event. In our conversations with faculty, staff, and students, we heard real excitement and urgency for renewed attention to and support for public engagement. These conversations centered around several critical questions. What is the responsibility of higher education and our own campus community to proactively and purposefully use and leverage our scholarly knowledge and practices to address societal issues and problems? How can we signal and reinforce the value of multiple forms of public engagement with multiple publics, from the national policy arena to local community practice? And how can we as an institution better develop the capacity, including the tools, relationships, time, and support and incentive structures for high-quality public engagement? Across our conversations and the diverse perspectives expressed, a shared sentiment was that higher education institutions have an important role in addressing critical social justice issues facing our country, and that we can do better in realizing our roles. For instance, we heard from faculty who discussed very frankly with us the institutional barriers and norms that can sometimes disincentivize public engagement, including disciplinary or department cultures that have historically undervalued public engagement efforts or particular forms of engagement. We've heard from staff and faculty who are leading and developing community engagement programs. Some wrestle to design these initiatives in ways that recognize the challenges of, but reflect the importance of, equitable bidirectional relationships and partnerships that honor and draw on the expertise of community members and that serve both institutional and community goals. We've also heard from students who see their faculty mentors face the sometimes dual and competing pressures of fulfilling traditional academic requirements while also engaging in scholarship that impacts broader audiences, and them wondering how, and indeed is it worth it for them to engage? They ask, how can we affect public spaces and issues that we care about through our academic work and practice? How will it count? What has been perhaps a common and persistent theme in our conversations is a wish for our work at U of M to contribute to a more equitable and inclusive society, a desire for our work to be transformative. So while these conversations did illuminate important challenges, they also reflected both urgency and optimism that now more than ever, the mobilization of scholars, practitioners, and other community members grounded in knowledge, evidence, and integrity will be essential to advancing social justice, equity, and inclusion in our society. Finally, our conversations emphasized how our efforts around public engagement and DE&I must be linked. That is, for this institution to truly have the transformational impact on the state, nation, and world that it aspires to, these two areas must fit together and work together in concert. Now on to our main events. As you will note in your program, today's event is offered in two parts. Part one is a panel discussion that I hope will, among other things, prime our thinking as some of us move into part two, which is a breakout discussion session and opportunity to drill down on some of the issues that I've just mentioned. Now, our panel discussion. We're very excited to have this panel and this discussion because of the unique experiences, perspectives, and guidance that these individuals have to offer our institution. We're honored to have such an esteemed panel joining us. Their background and experiences represent a variety of public sectors, and their leadership has been critical in engaging policy, communities, and addressing critical social justice issues. Our panelists include Abdul El Sayed, former Democratic candidate for Michigan governor and former executive director for the Detroit Health Department and Health Office for the City of Detroit. I'm going in. Raise your hand. I'm not doing it in the order that you were seated in. Angela Reyes, executive director and founder of the Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation. Jim Leha, Director of Education and Community Engagement at the University Musical Society. Mary Jo Callan, Director of the Ginsberg Center for Community Service and Learning at the U of M. Luis Treyes, producer of Radio Ambulante at NPR and a 2018 Knight Wallace Fellow. And finally, our panel's moderator is Earl Lewis, Director of the New Center for Social Solutions and Professor of History and Afro-American and African Studies at U of M. Without further ado, I would like to invite President Mark Schlissel for some special remarks.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Dr. Chavis, for the kind introduction and for your leadership of our National Center for Institutional Diversity. I also want to thank our distinguished panelists and all of you who are here to engage in these very important issues. I think the standing room only or in the aisle seating here is testament to the quality of the panel and the important nature of the questions we're going to engage with today. I've always felt that the University of Michigan's breadth of excellence and public status provide us with a unique opportunity and a responsibility to help address society's most important problems. These include striving to achieve equity and social justice and increase cultural understanding. And they extend to challenging and refuting policies that perpetuate inequality in our world, those that harm lives and suppress talents of individuals from different backgrounds. For generations, the University of Michigan scholars have used their considerable intellectual power to combat injustice. They focus their research intently on changing society and educating the students who will lead us into a better world. The dissemination of research and its broad application are the very essence of social transformation. For instance, James Jackson's pioneering research has provided unprecedented insights on the influence of race on the lives and health of African Americans. His National Survey of Black Americans and National Survey of American Life are considered the most extensive social, mental, and physical health surveys of the Black population in the United States. Professor Emerita Patricia Guerin's work was instrumental to the U of M's defense of the use of race in admissions policies before the US Supreme Court. Her research provided conclusive proof of the benefits of diversity, that a racially and ethnically diverse student body has far-reaching and significant benefits for all students, whether they are minorities or non-minorities, and for our nation as a whole. Today, our work builds on the legacy and marches on in the quest of a better future for us all. And we're making a difference with our impact. For instance, the NCID's Diversity Scholars Network has engaged and mobilized more than 500 scholars from more than 200 institutions across the nation. And our Youth Civil Rights Academy, championed by Barry Checkaway, combines digital and face-to-face interactions to ensure that students can learn about and influence civil rights policies. Its goal is to prepare a new generation of school and community leaders to promote civil rights while expanding equal opportunity statewide. Our tradition of leading social change is one of the greatest legacies of the University of Michigan. It drives our work and reflects our values as a more than 2 centuries old public university. It's this ongoing legacy that makes our work here today even more meaningful. Today's event explores how we can unite the essential qualities of public scholarship with the added promise of academic innovation. It will address barriers within the University of Michigan and other institutions that inhibit scholars from sharing their work broadly. And it'll provide insights into how we can bring new energy and innovation into public scholarship through researchers who can transform our world. Our examination of social transformation through public engagement was made possible by the collaboration of our National Center for Institutional Diversity and our Office of Academic Innovation, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Alumni Association. Like all great academic endeavors, these colleagues saw an opportunity to advance knowledge through inquiry and education. Their work has embraced and built upon our values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, while breaking down disciplinary boundaries and discovering new ways to engage with the public. Nowhere else but Michigan could a collaboration like this exist. I'm thrilled that the U of M faculty, students, and staff are finding creative and meaningful ways to enhance and unite our pursuits of greater public engagement and innovation in research and education. I'm now honored to introduce social historian and educational leader, Dr. Earl Lewis. It does feel that I'm shortchanging him by referring to him simply as the moderator of today's panel. If a moderator presides over a discussion, Dr. Lewis would better be described as driving the examination and shaping the questions around these important issues for his entire career. We're very proud that he's returned to the University of Michigan to serve as the director, as you heard, of our newly formed Center for Social Solutions. He was previously a faculty member in our history department and then dean of the Rackham Graduate School before serving as provost at Emory University and earlier this year completing a successful term as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. He's also the editor, along with former U of M Provost Nancy Cantor, of a book series, Our Compelling Interests, about how diversity and inclusion are critical to our success as a society. This past spring, Dr. Lewis gave the commencement address at Berea College, urging graduates to provide, and I quote, morally anchored, valued-centered leadership. He also asked a very timely question that day, and one that informs our work this afternoon. He asked the students, what will you do to trouble the waters in an age of democratic need? Thank you all very much for coming. I turn it over to Dr. Lewis.
two mics, and I'm not sure which one is working and which one actually controls the volume. So let me see here. Not that one. Okay. Now the other one. Okay. All right. The danger of having two mics in a historian. All right. Thank you. There we are. We're live, and I'll put them. It's a pleasure to be back, Mark. Thank you for that introduction. And I have forgotten what I said to Berea. So it's interesting to be reminded about what's our responsibility as academics and educated citizens to trouble the waters, to actually try to improve this project that we call the American Experience in Democracy. I wanted to start with actually two little stories to help frame this afternoon's conversation. One takes us back almost 2 decades. It was the University of Michigan. And before Mary Jo, Barry and I took a group of deans, almost 17 of the 19 deans, into Detroit to have a conversation with community leaders about how the University of Michigan could engage more fruitfully and more effectively with communities in and around southeastern Michigan, especially in the city of Detroit. And it was a quite illuminating conversation because we went in always from our position of expertise. And we were reminded within very short order that there is human capital and intelligence and abilities all over. And I can still remember that afternoon where one of the community leaders looked at us and said, you know what? We're tired of being the subjects of your study. We're really tired of being the subjects of your study. If you want to engage in public engagement, then we want to co-author the studies with you. We want to figure out how to be the authors of those studies because they not only affect us individually, they affect the communities. And that was a challenge for this university, and I think every university I know. I spent the last 5 years, as was noted, underwriting higher education across the United States. 75% of the dollars from the Mellon Foundation went to support higher education. And so we would talk to leaders, and we realized that ingrained in our institutions was a behavior pattern that didn't always allow for the kind of innovation and creativity that was needed if we were really going to talk about public engagement. And so I can recall that time 2 decades ago, we put up a map of the University of Michigan and its entry points. And to an outsider, it looked like a maze, trying to figure out which door do you walk through, and if you walk through that door, do you get to any place? And a lot of people who looked at that map concluded that indeed it was a labyrinth and it was one of these tests. And a few of them got in, and as one person joked, we never get out. But that says something about our social complexity. And it also says something about what it means to engage in an act, an articulated act of social transformation. Because if we are really talking about public engagement and social transformation, it's not only our sense of going out into the community, it's the ways in which we invite the community back into the institution. And the question is, how do we both change at the same time? So that's one framing moment as we engage in today's conversation. The second framing moment actually brings us fast forward to about 4 years ago. Anthony Carnevale and his colleagues at Georgetown University and their Center for Higher Education and the Workforce issued a report. They looked at post-recession. At that point, of the 11.6 million jobs that had been created post-recession, 8.4 million went to individuals with a college degree or higher, a bachelor's degree or higher. 3 million went to individuals with at least some college. Only 80,000, 80,000, went to individuals with a high school degree or less. The power and the value of higher education was put in perspective when we looked at the transition from the Great Recession to that moment leading into 2015. Let's think about those numbers for a second and what it suggests about our responsibility if we're going to talk about public engagement. Because as some of you know, at the end of 2017, the McKinsey company issued a report. McKinsey projects that by 2030, 800 million jobs worldwide that exist at this moment will disappear. 54 million in the United States, 1/3 of the contemporary American labor force. New jobs that haven't been created, new occupations will be created. But it says something about those two stories what happened after the Great Recession and the value and the place of education as a transformative agent in American life going forward. If there's ever a time to talk about public engagement for both the public university and particularly a public research university, now is the time. Because what we suggest is that the macroeconomics of 20 years ago are not what we're going to face in the next 15 to 20 years. And in fact, there are going to be such profound shifts in the organizational work and the character of labor and the ways in which we think about opportunity. Some of the issues that have played themselves out in the public square, or who, as defined by who's on which side of the line, politically and socially, can only be exacerbated in a very short order. And that puts a bullseye around universities, because that suggests that we play a critical role in helping educating that populace, but also in providing sort of the groundwork for those who will become really, truly full citizens of this nation. So I started with those two stories. One about the University of Michigan 2 decades ago and what we thought we would be able to achieve, and what no doubt has happened in the 14 years I've been away. And the other about what we can perceive that will happen in 12 to 13 years from now, where we will see increasing change in the microeconomic structure of the global labor economy, let alone the American labor economy. And I come back to my colleagues, and we began to ask a question about social transformation and public engagement. And so let's start and have some fun as we begin to try to explore these things, because it's impossible to talk about universities and their publics without also talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because one of the things I will conclude with is this, is that there's a vast amount of human talent in this world. Vast amount of human talent. What has often been denied is the access to opportunity. And the challenge for us all is to figure out, how do we create new, sustainable pathways for opportunity? And so with that, you've heard the brief bios of the panelists, and so let's open it up. Let's start by asking just a general question. Let's give the audience a little sense of the work you've been undertaking. In brief, I mean, I realize if I open it up wide open, we'd be here all afternoon. But in brief, and how and in what ways you imagine universities playing a role in your work today? Luis?
Yes, so I am a reporter and producer with Radio Ambulante. It's a podcast distributed by NPR. We tell stories about Latin America and Latino communities in the US. And in many ways, I see the media often as intermediaries between academia and a wider public. In my case as a journalist, expert sources are part of what I do. They bring a necessary context. They open up stories. How to identify those expert sources can sometimes be a challenge, and how to interview them in a way that can connect with the wider audience can be an even greater challenge sometimes. So that's one initial approximation to your question.
Great, thank you. Abdul.
So I think you all have a pretty good sense of what I've been up to, and if you don't, then I clearly didn't do a very good job of it. So I started my career in academia. My first job out of grad school was to teach at a grad school, and as a professor in epidemiology, which is about as applied as you get in terms of the kinds of spaces that you can work, I was doing work around complexity science and public health. And ultimately, I'll tell you a story about why I left the academy, hopefully with reference to what the academy can be doing. I was hosting a symposium on a topic of complex systems and causal inference in epidemiology, which is as esoteric as it sounds. And a senior professor whom I couldn't get to give me the light of day, a year before, came up to me afterwards and said, this is going to be path-altering work. It's going to change everything. And I literally looked at him and I just couldn't keep a straight face. I was like, this is going to change nothing, honestly, really. We all just had a great conversation. Then we had really great cheese and there was some wine. And everybody felt real good about themselves. We pat ourselves on the back and we get to go and do this again in 3 weeks at the different place. And there are a couple of things I realized. The work that we were doing was never beyond the self-reference of the academy itself. And the thing about complexity science is that you realize that when a system gets big, it usually gets self-referential. Its focus becomes itself. And the question we have to ask about the academic endeavor writ large, and then also universities generally, is how much have they focused outside of themselves? And what challenges do we give them? Whether it be the incentive set that a professor has, i.e. you publish in some esoteric journal that only other people who know what you know read, or are you publishing the commentary about what the implications of your work ought to be? And then the second question is, oftentimes, I was a tenure track academic at Columbia, and I was told that the way I was going to get tenure was going to be bring in grant dollars and write papers. Nowhere in there was the teaching side of things. Well, you could teach too if you want to, but we bought you out of 3 years of teaching, so there's that. The most important thing that this institution and any institution like it does is shape young minds. And beyond what we teach in the classroom is how we teach what we teach about what you ought to be. And the question I would ask, in line with the first point, is how are we modeling the taking of risks? The idea that there ought to be a different path than the one that is paved before you, if and when you are willing to engage and embrace the moral implications of what you do. And are we teaching that? Are we showing our students that? Or are we so focused on the institution and its own validation points and its own incentive sets that sometimes we forget that we actually have a moral responsibility to our young people? Not only about what we teach, but how we teach it. Not only about who gets to be a part of the institution, which is again self-referential, but what the institution is going to be about.
Thank you. Angela.
Thank you. I run a community-based organization in the Latino community in Detroit, where I was born and have lived and worked my entire life. And we provide a number of services to young people and to their families, but also do community organizing around a number of social issues. But I actually wear a few different hats, right? Soy Mexicana de Detroit, which is kind of a split personality, because people often don't think of Latinos coming from the city of Detroit and being native to the city of Detroit. I'm also an alum of the School of Public Health of Michigan. I think I bleed blue in more ways than one. And I'm also a founding member and a board member of the Detroit Community Academic Urban Research Center, which has been working together for 23 years with my two colleagues here, Dr. Barbara Israel and Dr. Amy Schultz, who, if you can imagine, after 23 years are not just colleagues, but dear friends, doing community-based participatory research, which is a whole different approach to research, which is a way to elevate the voices of the people who live in the community who are most impacted by a lot of the issues that we're researching. We do work around environmental justice, immigration issues, education reform, equitable development, including housing and gentrification, and criminal justice, all of which have implications for research and which we've worked on with researchers in the University of Michigan predominantly over all of these years. CBPR has been a way not just to amplify the community's voices, to validate what we know, but also to provide us pathways to address those issues, not just interventions, but also policy and systemic change, which is really what we need to be doing in most cases. And we need to change the system which has been designed to create disparities by its very root. So being able to have the science and the evidence behind supporting not only what we know, but also what those interventions may look like and what those policy implications are, has been critically important to those of us in the city of Detroit. So it is the longest standing that I am aware of partnership between the University of Michigan and the city of Detroit, and has also been the longest standing and deepest partnership between the African American and Latino communities working together in the city of Detroit. And we've had a number of successes, which I can talk about later on, but have deep implications for the work that we're doing in the city of Detroit now more than ever.
Great, thank you. Jim.
So I come at this from the lens of the performing arts. UMS, University Musical Society, is the performing arts center affiliated with the University of Michigan. We are a little bit unusual in the sense that we're I think it's turned on. Oh, it turned itself off in my pocket. Hopefully that works now. Let's see. We're a little unusual in the sense that we are an independent 501c3 that also has had a long affiliation with the University of Michigan. It's important to our identity because we've been both of the university and of the community throughout our whole history. I'm also reflecting on kind of what does it mean, what do the performing arts sort of mean right now to the world, to our community? And I actually kind of came to a personal crisis about 1.5 years ago thinking like, when I went to Michigan, I was a student leader, an activist in the LGBT community, and I thought, where has that sort of radical side of myself gone in relationship to how I do my work in the arts? And I'm really trying to interrogate the question personally of if the sort of ideal of the Performing Arts Center is to be, say, the metaphorical town square that we all have access to, how does it actually become a space that we all have access to? Who has access to it? How do they get there? Who is a spectator? Who's a participant? What kind of resources do people have? And this goes for communities, artists, as well as what we might think of as audience members. And that's a really complicated question to ask right now because it's not even actually clear anymore if we're capable of having any kind of town square, if we're as an American culture, like a space where we can actually come together and understand difference and also improve the ways in which we understand each other as humans. I was part of an NEA conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I was reminded that the mission, one of the critical pieces of the mission of the NEA is to improve human understanding through the arts, which just seems so completely idealistic right now, which might sound pessimistic, but I think it's actually a call to action. So a couple of projects that have been important to me in the recent past, UMS engaged in something called No Safety Net, which was a series of provocative theater works really focused on social justice issues. One example was a production called Underground Railroad Game, which really was interrogating black-white racial divide and how the sort of effects of slavery really impacts our interpersonal relationships. And my thinking about this series and our thinking as an organization was really to say, we put stuff on stage, it encourages people to think and talk, but actually embedded in a lot of artistic work these days is a call to action. And so I really got to thinking about how does what we do call people to action? So one of the direct ways that we responded to that call to action was as an arts organization, we hosted an anti-racism workshop where we thought, we'll just try this and see what happens, and why would an arts organization do this actually? We thought, 40, we sort of capped it at 40 people. We had double the demand, and it was all in response to this notion that people are really thinking about this issue in the community, and they want language, they want practice, they want understanding. So I was very happy to be able to kind of make that connection between a call to action and actually doing something, right? And I would say just, one more example that's coming to mind, and Angie is here, that Mexicanos de Detroit is a very powerful social network. And we work frequently with Mexican and Mexican-American artists at UMS, and just about 1.5 weeks ago, hosted a dinner with leaders from the Mexican-American community at El Asador in Southwest to bring people together, to let them know that we are doing these presentations. But it's not just about UMS letting people know these things are happening and trying to sell tickets. It's really about bringing the community together to really network with each other, and also to express to us kind of what the concerns are. And what I'm hearing from the community has to do with the crisis at the border and the degradation of Mexican culture in the US right now, and how important it is to preserve and lift up the beautiful things about the culture. And also a lot of fear about the gentrification of the neighborhood and the most visible symbol of the culture in the region being lost to gentrification, and how we might think about, as an arts organization, helping preserve that. So for me, it's about permeability. It's about thinking about how do we let that into the organization and actually act on it. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Very good.
So before coming back to U of M, I was a student here and was really engaged both in my undergraduate, graduate, and graduate education.
You've got the same problem with the
Oh,
mic that I
no.
had.
Do I?
Yeah.
It's not even in my pocket.
It seems to be true.
The academia needs to understand the dual mic problem. You
Yeah.
gotta figure this out for everyone.
True.
Exactly.
Okay, hopefully that's better. Okay. Who knew this was going to be so hard? I had no idea. So I spent the first 90% of my career working in schools, in nonprofits, in governmental organizations, and in business. And at every turn, wondered where was the sort of courageous leadership that we need to solve increasingly complex problems. So locally worked for Washtenaw County in the city of Ann Arbor and a small nonprofit named Ozone House. And we were struggling with so many complex issues that were really symptoms of growing inequity. And I can't tell you the number of times either me or my colleagues said, where is U of M? Where is U of M? We are literally in the backyard of this amazing institution, and we could use some partnership here. We know that there are rooms full, auditoriums full of brilliant, brilliant, passionate people. And where are they? And as someone who felt both a deep love for this institution and, frankly, a moral debt to earn some of what I have been really handed, mostly because of my identity, I wanted to come back and be a part of changing this amazing and really flawed institution. And as it turns out, sector. And so at the Ginsberg Center, I am really lucky to work with amazingly talented people, and so many of you in this room, faculty, staff, and students, by having sort of a leg in the community, engaging with community-based partners, and a leg in faculty and academic affairs, trying to support our faculty colleagues who want to do this work, who have the ability to do this work, but who need to, as scholars, to be nurtured and protected to do this work. And then working with students. We work with 3,000 to 5,000 students a year who came to this place to make a world that none of us have ever seen. So that's sort of what I'm doing here. I'm not sure what I'm doing on the panel, but it's pretty awesome.
Well, let's explore why you're on the panel with a follow-up, which is thinking about how you perceive the university from the Ozone House, and now that you're in the university, and thinking about partnership. So you had a question when you were sitting on the other side of town. Now you're inside. How do you answer your question? How does a small not-for-profit in Washtenaw County forge a relationship, and not only a relationship, but a partnership with the university mission?
Well, partnership, like a good marriage, sort of is a two-way street. And the way, so as a former community partner, certainly we sometimes, it felt like stumbled onto wonderful partnerships and relationships. We, faculty and or students and or staff, reached out to us and said, we want to be here, we want to do this work, and we're committed to do it for, no one sort of committed to do what the Detroit URC has done, but really we want to be in this work for the long term. I think the key to finding the right partner is to take what is, let's say, how many faculty? 7,000 doors, and then you add 46,000 students, 46,000 more doors, and I don't know how many staff, but it's a lot. That's too many doors. And so we are incoherent to the community. And so one way to help community partners find the resources, the partnership that can benefit their work, and more importantly, the communities that they are working with and working in partnership with, is to lend some coherence, even some coordination to our efforts, to create some visible ways that folks can engage.
Thank Angela, may I follow up? You mentioned a partnership that's lasted for 23 years, if I remember the number correctly.
Yes.
How did that partnership emerge? And like any partnership, how has it lasted so long?
Those are all really good questions that we're still trying to answer, actually. As most of you are aware, not just the University of Michigan, but universities in general are held in very high suspicion, particularly in communities of color, with good reason, because there has been a lot of abuse and many unethical things that have occurred in the community. So 23 years ago, when folks like Barbara and other folks from the University of Michigan came to Detroit and said they wanted to work with us, what they didn't realize at the time is many of us stayed at the table because we said, okay, the University of Michigan is coming. They didn't go away. They kept coming back. And we said, well, if they're going to stay here and they're not going away, we better stay at the table to make sure they don't mess things up. So we actually have continue and have always seen ourselves as gatekeepers to protect our community, which is, although it may sound funny, is pretty serious to us because of that history of abuse. But over time, the establishment of trust, I think, was a critically important thing. One is that people did what they said they were going to do. They walked their talk. Transparency was a critically important thing, even with things like budget. Money is a source of power, right? So not only being able to see the budget, but sharing the resources was critically important, because many times people think that communities are just sitting there waiting for researchers to show up and do focus groups in your community and write papers, and that's not necessarily the case. It takes time and effort on the community's part, and one of the things that we have that's most valuable to us is time, because we don't have a whole lot of money, right? What we have is time and our knowledge of the community. So we're contributing that, which is for us a valuable resource, back to the community, to the university, and the knowledge that we have. So recognizing that, paying for that, at least whatever they're able to pay for out of that, and sharing the decision-making and the power has been critically important, that we had a say all along the way of what the research questions were, how they were going to be interpreted, how it was going to be used, where it was going to be disseminated. I have had the opportunity to co-author and co-present at many, many, many events and many papers, and even one chapter of a textbook that most of the people in the rest of my life don't really pay attention to, except in the university. What, a textbook? But it really makes a difference when the community has that leverage and that power and being seen as equals with the university, and acknowledging that just because we're community residents in communities of color or poor community doesn't mean we're stupid, doesn't mean we don't have resources, doesn't mean we're not intelligent or educated. So it's validating those indigenous sources of knowledge and lifting them up and respecting them and respecting the various cultures. And I think all of those things have been really critically important along the way.
Great, thank you. Abdul, you've almost had an ethnographer's perspective, having been inside of the academy and now on the other side, as you outlined in your introduction. When you think about partnerships, particularly when you went to the city of Detroit and had this public health enterprise, what questions did you ask of universities as they either came knocking on the door or you went looking for them?
Yeah, so I actually had the privilege of working with the URC and with the community organizations that are a part of it as sort of this weird government space, which is constantly redefining itself. And it was interesting because for me, I went from being on the tenure track at a big university to walking into a department that had just been, or 3 years ago, been shut down and privatized, and with the work of trying to rebuild that department. And it struck me when I was talking to researchers that they were not asking the question that I had the privilege of not asking literally just 3 weeks before I started, which is, what is the point of this research, right? A lot of times with academics, they'll say, well, we can publish this. And you'll say, fantastic. and why does it matter, right? Usually with a couple of expletives involved. And oftentimes we don't actually answer that question because the incentives in the institution are not usually based on what is the global or even local impact of this work. It is how many X have you published, papers, textbooks, whatever that widget is that an academic is making, right? And the humility, I think, that we all have to find is in asking, what is the question you want answered? And why? And how can I think about what my incentives are as an academic and your incentives are to actually do good stuff in the world, right? And how do we put those together? And part of the problem is that we in the academy, and I say we loosely, but in the academy, we don't actually ask what the point is often. What is the end outcome of the world that you want to build? And how is your research actually moving that forward? Because it's a rat race. Everybody will tell you in academia it's a rat race. Well, the question is toward what end and what's the goal? And I think as a government bureaucrat, had to ask that question very, very directly. Because a lot of folks that you'll talk to will say, yeah, well, we already worked with this, you name the department, and you name the department published their papers, and we never heard from them again. And nothing changed, and those papers don't mean anything to us, right? But somebody got tenure off of it, which is fantastic for them, right? And so those questions matter. And then the last thing I'll say is this. Until we start incentivizing our researchers to be driving something in the public space, right? And what I mean by incentivizing, I mean literally quantifying it. Just like we quantify publications, just like we quantify grant dollars. Until we start incentivizing that, the incentives aren't going to shift. You're going to keep finding really great souls who think outside of their box, but most of the institution will continue driving in one particular direction. And then the last thing I'll just say is this. Nobody reads our journals. Everybody in this room reads the journals. Nobody actually reads the journal. And the fact of the matter is, when we talk about how science and intellect have been marginalized in this moment, it's because we marginalized them. It's because we never did the work of saying why this matters and how do we translate it to people who didn't have the privilege of getting a PhD or a medical degree, let alone a bachelor's. We marginalized ourselves. And so if we want to demarginalize ourselves, then we have to do the work of saying, okay, great, you published your paper in AJPH, you published it in whatever journal it is that your area cares about. What did you do to translate it? How did you show the world what this means about real problems on the ground?
So Luis, as you're thinking about what Abdul just said and thinking about your radio audiences, and so how do you select as a producer what pieces to cover, which academics to feature, and the ways in which you actually began to think through the whole question of whether their work will have impact, let alone lead to some kind of social transformation?
Yes, first of all, I have to say that as I listen to Angela and Abdul, I feel chills because it's so close to problems that are endemic in the media as well. I mean, you can substitute academic journal for media outlet, and we'll be having the same conversation. So there is a lot to be said and to think about in terms of researchers and, yes, national journalists parachuting in to communities with an attitude of saying, we know you better than you know yourselves. And that's something that you always have to be aware of. And I think the desire for the people in academia to reach out with a voice that connects with the wider public is genuine and real, but is there a desire to really listen? And I think the media, I heard the concept two-way street, and I think that's a very important concept because the media is an intermediary in two ways. It can bring academia closer to communities, but how many tenure-track professors, researchers, et cetera, are really hunkering down and really actively listening to local and hyper-local media outlets to try to really understand what the needs are in the community, not just the echo chamber of national media. I mean, I enjoy a Maggie Haberman article in the New York Times with the best of them, but beyond that, how much active listening is being done through local media outlets in my experience, so Radio Ambulante is a Spanish language outlet. We cover stories, long form stories in Latino communities. We come from the idea that with 55 million Latinos in the US is a Latin American nation as well. And that's how we approach the coverage. But it can be amazingly frustrating when we're trying to do science stories. You know, that affect Latino populations. I remember the last one I did was, it started with a research paper on a certain type of bee. I'm from Puerto Rico, that had evolved in Puerto Rico. Killer bees that had been very dangerous and aggressive throughout Latin America had suddenly turned docile. And that had like real important implications because these were sturdier bees that were resisting colony collapse disorder, et cetera. So I get to talk to these researchers, and they're like, the bees are wiped out by the hurricane. Hurricane Maria wiped out the bees. I'm like, oh, well, then I have no story. But I start, then I start talking about the part that wasn't in the research paper. So how did you start to work with the bees? And well, there's local beekeepers. They're out there, you know, they're kind of crazy. So I start going to these beekeepers. These are informal community ecologists who had spent 5 months after the hurricane basically chasing down bees that had been displaced by the hurricane. And so this is one case where the research paper was the start. And the professors that I had worked, the researchers that I was talking to were very close to really important human story, but they were just not that interested in it. Yeah. And I think that kind of boils down a lot of what happens sometimes. The human core of the research kind of gets diluted. And I think as, you know, again, we have a very important role in the media to try to connect that human story with the research, but also we can't forget the responsibility that people in academia have to also go further as well.
Thank you. Jim, you said earlier on that the arts have this way of perhaps introducing various publics to a topic, but in today's world, and particularly in the public square, we seem to be on one side or the other. When I lived in New York, it was cute to say for a while that the only thing that the Obamas and the Cheneys could agree on was how good Hamilton was as a play. They both saw the play Hamilton, and they both apparently liked it. And so there was this some way of showing at least some sense that the public square could create an atmosphere where people could debate things that they saw and understood. You may know that the Public Theater has begun a national tour of the play Sweat. Lynn Nottage's play Sweat, which is an examination of the deindustrialization of Erie, Pennsylvania, and what happens to people across racial and gender lines as they deal with this profound change that occurred circa 2000, leading into 2008. I come back to thinking about then the arts and partnerships. I mean, how do we go about creating spaces and places for people to actually engage the arts? Are we obligated to take them into communities, bring communities to those settings, figure out some other kind of way? Lynn Nottage told me when she, after the Sweat premiere, first at the Public and then on Broadway, she eventually took it to Erie, Pennsylvania, the week after the 2016 presidential election. And they opened it up to 600-700 people in Erie, Pennsylvania to come to see it for free. And it was overflowing. And it was, at the end of it, they had a talk back. They didn't have all the props and all, but the actors went through it. And they had a talk back. And the former mill workers and the former mill owners finally said, this is the first time we actually saw the same thing and realized that we had not talked to one another in the intervening decade and a half. The power of the arts to actually draw people in, it can become a space and a place where conversations can be had. But how do you do that? How do you find the right partnership?
That's a great question. Yeah. How do we do that? I think, you know, in terms of this question of going out or drawing in, I mean, I think the obvious answer is you have to do both. And certainly, you know, one of the one of the sort of drawbacks of the arts is that people think of it as an elitist art form, and of course many performing arts organizations are majority white institutions that have these long histories that revolve around elevating certain kinds of cultural expressions as being more valuable than others. And I think our work now is to really imagine how people have more access to these artistic spaces. So some of that is taking work into places where we think it might be the most relevant, finding partners that work with us to kind of bridge what the artist's intention is to a particular community. I think a good example of that was a few seasons ago. We presented a work by a dance artist named Nora Chepamire, who's a Black dance artist. She is interested, her work was really interested in sort of interrogating her biography through her father's biography. And the work was set in a boxing ring. And she had never performed the work actually in a gym where there was a boxing ring. It had always been done on a stage. And we thought, well, in Detroit, there's something called the Detroit Boxing Gym, which is a youth services organization that's really invested in developing sort of educational opportunities for youth through boxing, essentially, and developed a partnership with that group in order to bring the work there. And I think what's interesting is what happens is you have this kind of collision of audiences that go to UMS things, that come from Ann Arbor to Detroit. They're coming to a neighborhood that they've never been before, they feel uncomfortable in, perhaps. So there's this experience for the sort of prototypical UMS patron, but then you've also created an opportunity for people that are closer to this community to actually have better access to work just geographically, don't necessarily need a car, don't have to make the trip to Ann Arbor, and we're in a space that sort of authorizes the work. And I think that that's part of partnership, is that, as Angie said, partners are gatekeepers often. As we are all gatekeepers to the University of Michigan, and taking your role as a gatekeeper seriously is pretty important. And that's an example of, I think, using partnership to kind of move artistic work and artistic intention out of sort of our geographical space and into others. On the flip side of that, like, how do you draw people in? I don't know. We went through this question over and over again during the No Safety Net series. Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to solve America's problem of people from different political perspectives being able to be like in the same room together and have a conversation through a theater series. I hope so. But one of the one of the intentions of that series, I think, is also to I think we all imagine that there's a choir that we sort of preach to, but even within the choir, people aren't necessarily sure where they stand on certain kinds of issues. And that's a sort of fine-tuned thing to say. So like, what that means is, even if you think of yourself, say, as a particularly progressive person, there are things that you have, that you still have to learn. And I think one of the great examples of that from No Safety Net, we had to do with a performance by a gender non-binary, gender non-conforming performer named Becca Blackwell, and basically, with our stakeholders, with our kind of core audience, having very little relationship to this idea of what is gender non-binary, what is gender non-conforming, we found ourselves in a position of needing to do a lot of educating to really think about how to open this door to people so that they could even kind of get to the work. We did work with Equality Michigan, where we brought some folks in to really talk about what is it like to be transgender or non-binary person in the state of Michigan, which really, I mean, in most places, has very little to no protection for gender non-conforming people legally, and where they are subject to, to much violence and discrimination. We worked with the Spectrum Center, of course, so this is just pulling people together to really build out stories of people that are in the local community, that are actually our kind of, that really are our community members, to make that connection between sort of the stage and how we go out into the world. I mean, again, it's like there is a call to action embedded in that work, which is to say, please treat people better, right? And like try to understand something that might be incomprehensible to you. We did have the Michigan Review come and review all 3 productions favorably. So that was my that was my big success moment, reaching across the sort of progressive, conservative divide as far as No Safety Net went. And I feel pretty proud of that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
We will turn to audience questions. Let me ask one question before turning to the audience questions. Think back to the founding of this institution in the 19th century and looking at its racial demographic composition and thinking ahead to this institution in the middle of the 21st century where almost all demographers project a non-white majority. And that has profound implications since a lot of that population is anchored along the seaboards, the eastern seaboard, the Gulf, and the Pacific of the West Coast. And you have a sort of a different demographic makeup in the middle of the country, outside of a handful of large metropolitan areas. Thinking about university partnerships, not in the 19th century context or 20th century context, but a 21st century context. If you have one thing you would want to write at the top of your list that universities should be considering as they look ahead to the middle of the 21st century, what would be at the top of your list? Angela, you're nodding. So.
Yeah, that's actually very much on my mind because I just came back from a meeting with folks from across the country talking about how do we help young men of color persist and graduate from universities and post-secondary education. I think the first thing we're going to have to do is change our language. Already 60% of children 17 and under are young people of color. We're not minorities. We're the majority. 17 is college-going age. So my question to the University of Michigan is, how will you be prepared to help young men and women of color to not only enter but succeed in this university? What practices do you need to change? How will those young people see the faculty as a reflection of themselves? Will they be prepared culturally? Will they understand all of the challenge that young people of color who are coming from poor urban school districts, for the most part, face coming to a university like the University of Michigan, being separated from their families and their communities and culture, and how frightening and scary and lonely it feels for people of color to come into a university like the University of Michigan. So I think it's a huge challenge and a huge responsibility that universities across the country have failed to face. They're not ready. I can tell you that we are not ready, and it's not 21st century, it's tomorrow. It's now. And we really need to make some systemic changes to how we're teaching young people and how we're preparing them and how we're supporting them through this difficult process. Because without a post-secondary education, our young people will be condemned forever to a life of poverty. And we know that from research, right? So we need to be able to make some serious adjustments to what we're doing.
I want to go around, but may I just follow up with a question, because you said something that set off all the bells in my head, which is to think that we spent so much of the 20th century talking about access. How do you gain access to a place like the University of Michigan or any other noted institution of higher learning? But the paradigm should have shifted to one of success. We actually know how to actually enable students to gain the feedback. We have tools already in existence to move from an access paradigm to a success paradigm. And you seem to be talking about how, in an odd kind of way, universities in their research never, well, let me say it differently, seldom use the research in ways that actually address their own condition, even as they're framing out answers for others.
Yes. Absolutely. I don't know too many studies that the university does of itself and the systems that exist. And universities were founded on a system of racism and disparities. And those things are baked into the system So it's going to take a lot of work to dismantle those things and make significant changes.
Anyone else want to jump in?
So this institutions like it, command a deep level of respect, prestige, power among folks with respect, prestige, and power. And as we think about what we value, there is a relatively genteel academic way of thinking about poverty. And then there's rolling up your sleeves and being about addressing poverty. And the question I would ask to the Academy is, are we willing to speak truth to power to the rest of the system that has created profound levels of inequality in our society? And it's not just being able to take the quote unquote best and brightest from poorer schools or places where there's predominantly students of color, but it's also asking about how we reshape the system itself that then takes those kids out of those communities, right? And reifies a system whereby people who are left behind are never going to have access, right? We point to folks and students of color and say, see, we're doing our part. The question becomes, though, how many of those kids end up going to McKinsey or going to Bain or going to BCG, going to Goldman Sachs, becoming a part of making very, very rich corporations all that much richer, who then the university takes a lot of money from, whether that be individuals or as companies, right? And we're left at square one. It's not enough to say, well, we're going to solve poverty by picking a few kids up out of poverty, giving them access, success, right? And then allowing them to be a part of a system that just generates more poverty. The question becomes, are we willing to actually ask the system, however painful it is, to say this level of inequity and this system, right, whereby we reify this inequity, we're going to be a part of addressing that and being honest about what it means to just change the system. I think in the 21st century, whether we're talking about low-income people of color or low-income white folks in some of these rural communities who also get missed by this conversation, when we situate ourselves in what a lot of folks see as a brewing culture war, the question becomes, can the university be a part of addressing on its own principles a system that has left poor people behind? And in that way, be a real challenge on poverty. And it may be student-led, it may be faculty-led. I certainly hope, though, that it's administration-led. Because if it is, I think we have an opportunity to be leaders on an issue that will define the next 50 years.
Are you running for office?
Anyone else want to?
I mean, I immediately, of course, I haven't even talked about this work, but the deeper that I dive into working in the K-12 and public education community in the state of Michigan, the more I understand the need for our resources to be serving the public school system in the state of Michigan. And I see a university in the future that's much more invested in really saving public education, which is to me, it may sound flip to say, but really is at the root of this question of what is a democracy and how do people make sense of the kind of micro level of their lives into the macro. Because I think for most people, and I also think this connects to the poverty question as well, it's very hard to make sense of how what's happening in Lansing or Washington, D.C., or even at my city council affects me if I'm trying to make it from day to day. And that to me is really, and the key to all of that is education, period.
Mary Jo, Luis, anything?
Quickly, I hope that in the middle of this century, so that's not very far from now. Aren't we almost in the middle of this century?
Close about a minute.
Here's what I hope. One, that we see ourselves as community, as in the communities in which we engage, that we build an infrastructure to support ethical and sustained engagement, and that infrastructure matches our ethos around community engagement and engagement. We have a country who it thinks of itself, sort of liberty and justice, but we don't have an infrastructure to support that. And I would say the same about our university now. That the why of engagement, I think that we absolutely proceed with the best of intentions. The what, we get, engage. But the how actually matters most. And so my hope is that we grow into and live into and learn into how to engage in ways that actually have the impact we intend, and not just whatever impact happens.
Yeah, from my own perspective, I would just say I would love to see the university community thinking more deeply about how to communicate and connect, and how to engage members that are outside of communities that are outside the university, how to engage them in crafting messages that let communities know this research matters for you and this is why.
Thank you. Let's turn to some questions from the audience. First one, and I'm jumping around, so I'm curating these. But following Angela Reyes' comments on unethical impact on indigenous communities in the past, what constitutes unethical public engagement? And might we hear some examples? Unethical public engagement. So if you think about public engagement and social transformation, I guess the writer, questioner is wondering, we talk about unethical behavior in other settings. Right? Can there be such a thing as unethical public engagement on the part of an institution?
Yes.
And we have examples, and so they're asking for elaborations, examples.
I think failing to appreciate the terms of the conversation. I was watching coverage of a young black man facing felony charges, having a conversation with a judge in a courtroom, right? And you just think about the power structure. You got this individual who's standing on a dais wearing ritual garb, right? Speaking down to another individual who's got his hands cupped behind his back wearing a different ritual garb. Imagine if the same exact conversation happened between those two people on the street in some neighborhood in Detroit, right? And I'm not saying that we should change the way that we, that courts operate. Actually, we should, but that's part of, not part of this point. The point that I'm making is sometimes we have a conversation and we bake in the frame of the debate. And I think it is unethical of us not to actually be asking, what are the power differentials when this conversation is happening? And oftentimes, a lot of the research questions that we ask bake that in, and then we're answering questions that don't actually ask the bigger picture about what were the circumstances for both of these actors. And so oftentimes when we talk about poverty, it ends up blaming the poor in some particular way. We see it all the time. And the university pushes it. I mean, a lot of early research in my own area on health disparities was about health behavior. If these people just made better decisions about what they ate, then life would be great. You're like, okay, yeah, great, but how far are you from a grocery store? How expensive is the food at the grocery store? What are the norms about what you eat in the first place? Do you have the money to afford the stuff that's at the grocery store? And beyond all of that, why the hell isn't there a damn grocery store in the neighborhood? But these people should probably make better decisions about how they eat. And so we have to be real thoughtful about the way that we engage research, because oftentimes as a scientist, you just say, here's what my paper showed, right? Rather than actually asking, did I ask the right question? And what implications does that have for reifying a frame of reference that may in fact do more harm than good?
I think that there are some actually really interesting examples in the media and also in the performing arts in particular around authorship and who gets to tell which story. And I think that we've heard a little bit about that from other panelists. But there's actually a kind of, there's a famous French-Canadian theater director called Robert Lepage who has been embroiled in two really kind of high-profile cases in the arts communities of first making work about slavery and the experience of slaves and actually not incorporating any black voices into his process or into the casting or writing of a performance. And something similar was about to happen with a work that he was creating about the sort of origins of Canada and the Indigenous peoples of Canada, where there were no Indigenous voices and no Indigenous people included in the creative process. And so that's a very high profile and very visible example of someone taking a story that isn't their own and putting it on a stage and having a lot of resources and being able to do that. I think that that has trickle-down effects for organizations like ours, who really do have to ask ourselves the question of like, if you don't have a sort of representative group of people making decisions about what you put on stage, what do you do? And that is a question that we are absolutely grappling with at UMS. Yeah.
I think there are opportunities all along the entire process of public engagement to do it unethically.
Yeah.
From how you come into the community to where you have where you're publicly engaging people, who's doing the asking, what are the questions, how's the process, and what do you do with the engagement once you've got it? So I've participated in not more than a few very large public engagements to get community feedback on a process. All that information was taken and then it wasn't used. And the community knew it because they saw the final product and there was like, where was all the input that we gave? It was never used, it was completely disregarded. So I think there are a number of ways to be unethical in how you engage the public. So I think it's about being humble and about allowing the community or the public that you are engaging to help to determine what those parameters are and to have an equal say in that process.
I would just quickly add, one, they got the product, they got to see it, so that's pretty good. But that doesn't always happen.
So that doesn't always happen.
I would say that just generally speaking, there's a lot of examples. Many folks in the room could share examples of unethical engagement. We think a lot about sort of the equation of engagement and who benefits. And I'm happy to say that U of M has moved to talking about mutual benefit, which is really important. But that is not nearly enough. So we really need to talk about equity and benefit. We come always with more, certainly financial resources at our back, more time, and so to think about how each party benefits and making sure that we're all each getting our fair share and that what we're getting, we both agree to and co-create.
There's a question here about the use of social media as a tool. And I'll just cut right to the heart of the question, which is how do we find a balance between incentivizing engagement through social media and ensuring that social media is used responsibly?
Good question.
I have no idea.
We stumped the panel.
Look, they say Twitter sells hate, Instagram sells envy, Facebook sells you. There is, I mean, honestly, this is something that I've thought a lot about because on the campaign, a lot of our communications were focused on social media. The problem is let's be clear, you can't say anything profound in 280 characters. It's really hard to be equitable in 280 characters. And because the nature of the conversation is so fleeting, it incentivizes this sort of hyper-fast news cycle where nobody has the time to get it right. So there's a really great book by a guy named Neil Postman. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Horrible title. Good book, though. And he makes the argument that the moment that information started to move faster than people could was the moment we all got really burdened by having to pay attention to things that were outside of our frame of control. And he talks about this moment in the printing press being the first time anybody actually had to deal with real fake news. Why? Because you never knew where the information was coming from, and because we hadn't gotten used to getting information from other parts of the world, you actually had no system of verifying what was real and what was not. What's interesting is that for a long period of time since then, we've been pretty good at verifying because the news cycle, right, was long enough to sustain the capacity to verify the news. Now, with social media, the news cycle is so fast that it's actually, by the time you've verified what's true and what's not, we moved on. And social media does that. And so you have this incentive to be a part of the debate, right, in a really non-thoughtful and flitting kind of way that emphasizes sarcasm and, and a hot take, rather than a deep, thoughtful analysis of what actually just happened, right? And it drives this sort of wave-like deep anger and polarization. I mean, you go on Twitter, right, and you just put in #Kavanaugh and just look at what comes up. And there are two Twitters on this. There's not one middle conversation of asking, well, what does it mean to believe someone when they come with something like this? What does it mean to think through what this does to the institution of the Supreme Court and the way that we make these decisions? There is cancel Kavanaugh and Justice Kavanaugh, right? There's really nothing in the middle. And I'm, beyond what I think about this, we have a responsibility to be thinking about, well, how do we responsibly engage in this medium, right? That just by its nature as a systems entity drives polarization. And I don't know that we have an answer on this quite yet. I do know that it's probably going to be evolving, but it also means that people who are stewards of the public conversation or stewards of truth in the public conversation do have a responsibility not to pile on, right? And I think the fact-checking capacity of the academy is more important now than it ever has been. And the ability to do it fast and the ability to do it in a small space, that really matters. And it's never mattered more.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and kind of take another track to this argument, which is it can be a powerful tool. And I think you can't approach Twitter as Twitter with a capital T. There's all sorts of Twitterverses going on in there. You have Latino Twitter. Within that, you have Latino Detroit Twitter. You scratch the surface a little more. You have Puerto Rican in Detroit Twitter. You have Mexican in Detroit Twitter, Yeah. And I think it can be a powerful tool if you work correctly and go further to try to reach audiences and engage audiences that might not be attuned to the work that you're putting out. But you do need to recognize where those audiences are and how to reach them within that social media sphere.
I think specifically related to encouraging public engagement through social media, I think it is a really important tool. I think doing it thoughtfully and ethically is really important. Ensuring that we are honoring and respecting and not exploiting those with whom we're engaging and treating them as subjects and celebrating sort of our own service and own good deeds sort of at the expense or exploitation of others. To me, this speaks to, again, the importance of building an infrastructure for students and faculty and staff to think about how do we engage, what do we need to know before we sort of proceed to have, again, the impact that we intend.
I think it's still evolving, and it is evolving very quickly, but it differs in different populations. In our community, if we want to get information out, we'll put it on Facebook, but we still have to do face-to-face. We still have to go out and meet people and talk to them and hand them something, and they have to know you and trust you in order to come to anything that we're promoting. On the other hand, one of the challenges in reaching people in a community is that people's phone numbers change all the time, right? But with young people, we can send them a Facebook message and we'll get an immediate response. So there's a variety of ways, and particularly with the digital divide in many communities still, they may not have the internet, but they have a cell phone. Yeah. So how are they using the cell phone? Kids may have social media, parents may not. So it really varies. We're still trying to figure out what's the best way to use it in a way that's productive and useful for a community. I know that I'm always very careful about what I post on Facebook because my mother might see it. But, but also kids that I work with or other people in the community. So it's a fine line on public discourse and over publicizing your own private lives too. So
I just feel very happy to be in a business that still requires people, for the most part, to show up and be in a room together, where they have to actually see each other's faces and hear each other's voices in the most literal of senses. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't use the tools of social media in the way that we work with communities. And very much like Angie has alluded to, I think what's important for us as a kind of nonprofit organization is just to understand that there are just a wide variety of cultural practices that go along with every kind of social media that you can possibly imagine, and that's another kind of cultural awareness or competency that we all need to cultivate as people that are from the university, which is very much a kind of email culture, you know, out into a world that uses a wide variety of tools to communicate with each other.
We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so there are a number of questions that have come in. One, and I'll ask two, and you can answer either one or neither. One follows on our last conversation. Supposing you're willing to speak truth to power, but establishment media don't want to hear or publish what you're saying, how do you get heard? And so that's one question. And the other question has to do with the university and bringing people in and creating this public square where all voices can be heard. And there's a secondary question here. How does the university publicly engage conservatives? Is it disingenuous to try to socially transform them? And so one question about the public square and bringing people in and socially transforming them. The other one is how do you get heard using the ordinary channels, media channels, outside of social media?
Well, I'll take the social media question. Okay. I guess it's pretty specific to what I do. And I think it is a good question and a hard one. I know mainstream media people who will say, well, my editor didn't want to run this because they didn't want to get close to the story, because maybe it's speaking to power in a way that gatekeepers at that media organization are not letting through. So I use social media. But these are journalists whose profile is huge, you know, and you know they have no answer to the question. Well, I'm hitting myself. Well, I don't have the following that you have. I can put the stuff on my own social media, and yes, my mom will read it and probably approve of it, but it's not really breaking out in any way. I think that it's hard, but you have to identify outlets that will run with it and identify journalists and media people that are willing to look into things and topics and issues that perhaps national media organizations might not. The good thing is that the social media landscape, the media landscape in general, is extremely fragmented, but there are a lot more opportunities to engage now than there were 20 years ago. I know that's an imperfect answer. There's a lot of work that goes into finding the right outlet for these stories to come through, but there are more outlets out there that enable these stories to get out.
Thank you. Anyone else? Either the questions?
I mean, this might sound like a horrible response to this question, but I'm trying to encourage people to think about what it means to get involved in local government and also to run for public office. I hold a modest public office on the Ann Arbor District Library as a trustee. I am elected official. But it occurs to me actually that you know, I have an impulse to destroy the system just as much as any other radical does. But there are systems that exist within which we can be agents of power. Running for office is a very intimidating thing to do, but you might start by getting involved in a kind of local commission or committee that's working on an issue that you care about. And those committees and commissions exist here in our community in Ann Arbor and in many communities across the country, and they're desperate for people to pay attention to them. And so if you have something that you want to say, there's probably a space or an analog for you or within which you can say it in the context of a government where it actually might have an opportunity to influence. And we've got someone who is running for public office right here on the panel. But I just don't think enough people imagine that they can do that. I just don't think enough people imagine that for themselves.
Oh, I'll take the last question, actually. And I think it kind of goes back to the whole issue of research, in that data in and of itself does not change people's hearts and minds. Stories do, and making human connection to the heart, and being able to really use that data in a way that tells the human story and who who it really impacts. And I'll give you an example of one of the coalitions that I've been part of for the past 4 years has been working on educational reform in the city of Detroit, and we intentionally recruited folks from both sides of the aisle. Mind you, I'm to the left of Democrats, right? So it was a challenge, really, to sit in the room with folks, especially somebody who was one of the major fundraisers for the Republican Party and for the current president. And one of the data points that we had was the impact of the lack of public transportation on kids' inaccessibility to quality education. And he kept saying, transportation doesn't have anything to do with this. I don't understand why you even have that issue there. Until one of the community groups that we were part of organized a Walk With Me day. It was actually walk or catch the bus with me. And this gentleman who had, he got on the bus with a mom and her 3 kids. Mind you, the bus was followed by his bodyguard chauffeur driving his big SUV behind the bus. But nonetheless, he went with her. They had to catch the bus at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was dark. Get off of that bus. They came from northwest Detroit to southwest Detroit, got off that bus in a place there were a lot of abandoned houses, had to walk several blocks, drop one kid off, walk several blocks to another bus stop, wait again for the other kid. It took 2.5 hours. Then she had to take 2.5 hours to go home, and then 2.5 hours to come back and pick up her kids, and then another 2.5 hours. She couldn't work because she was spending all of her time dropping her children off in school on public transportation. And he said, I get it. I get it. He became a huge advocate for public transportation for children and access to quality education in your communities. It was that human interaction and understanding from that perspective of what it was really like for him to change his mind. And I think that's the power of research and community working together, is to be able to tell those stories.
I think one last just point. Look, I spent the last 18 months going all over the state, talking to all kinds of people. And you all know where I stand on the political spectrum. But the fact of the matter is that I have family who voted for Donald Trump, which you can imagine as a ethnically Egyptian, Muslim, American. That's an interesting conversation to have with your own family. But the fact is that so much of the conversation we think we're having is being had on traditional media or social media. If you're willing to actually sit down and look someone eye to eye, use those basic social skills you learned in kindergarten, which is smile at people when you talk to them, listen to them before you talk, look them in the eye when they're talking, you find that actually we share a lot more in common than this moment would have you think. And there's a lot of common ground to be had if we're willing to engage that. Now, I think the central question of a politics is, who are we and who do we want to be? And the operative point there is that there has to be some shared we. Everybody here does part of that work, right? This institution does part of that work of generating a shared we. But there has to be a shared experience, a shared sense of who the we is, who belongs in that we, and that's negotiated. And look, people who want to negotiate certain kinds of people out, they'll never be right, and that's why we actually have to be at the table negotiating them back in, right? But that also means dignifying the human around you rather than just saying, I disagree with you, I can't have this conversation with you, you're an awful human being, and I want to negotiate you out of the we, right? And so these conversations matter. And then just to the point on social media, the thing about your truth is that I don't know what the right answer about getting it out is, but I do know what the wrong answer is. The wrong answer is to say, well, I can't find anybody who's going to publish this, so I guess I'm just not going to keep talking about it, right? There's a lot of ways to get your truth out. And this work doesn't happen overnight. It's not like you get published once and everybody's like, I agree with that. And great, the world has changed. No, it's a consistent, persistent conversation that you keep having every time you get an opportunity to have a conversation. This is what my truth is. This is the way I think the world ought to be. This is who we ought to be, right? And that truth is yours. You should be willing to speak it, whether it's a tweet or the New York Times op-ed page or on CNN or to your mom, whoever it is. It's your truth. You should speak it.
Anyone else with a final word? If not, I want to thank the panelists for And I would like to thank the leadership at NCID, among others, for asking me back. This is an encore performance, I guess, from me as a moderator. I did it a couple of years ago when I was still at the Mellon Foundation. And Angela says something, and I'll end with a story, and then as a way to tie this all together. So a few years ago, our OCI project, Our Compelling Interest, the Value of Diversity for Prosperous Democracy, we're having an advisory meeting. And one of my colleagues shared a story. It was a story about Orange County in California, and where people were sitting in a public hearing and asking whether or not they wanted their taxes raised. And one person got up and says, I don't want my taxes raised for those people's children. And so another person got up and said, may I address the person who just spoke? And he says, and turned to the person and says, let me ask you 3 questions. First, do you ever plan to retire? And to which the first speaker said yes. When you retire, second question, do you plan on selling your home? He says, yes. And then the third one, who do you think is going to buy your home other than the children you invested in today? Because they're going to be in a position to buy your home in 10 to 15 years when you're ready to retire. So actually, you're not investing in them, you're investing in your retirement plan.
Mm-hmm. Who's going to pay?
And for the first time, that first speaker said a light bulb went on because he actually understood the circle of we to include him and not just them. Social transformation, let us find the we.
Thank you again to Earl Lewis and our panel. This is a really tough act to follow. I'm James Devaney. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Academic Innovation. I need to give you some logistics for where we're going to go from here, but I want to share a few reflections on the panel we just heard, and I'm going to try to talk fast because I know we're a little pressed on time. So I want 5 quick takeaways, and then some thoughts that I've been kind of noodling over here in the front row. First, Mary Jo called for courageous leadership to solve complex problems. Several of the panelists employed a series of metaphors, which I'll succinctly relay back as we want to look less like a labyrinth, have fewer doors, look more like a public square, and look more like a two-way street. We talked about universities and their publics, and I just want to underline the last word that we're using that in the plural, and that we need to think very deeply about the various publics that the University of Michigan interfaces with. We need to find new sustainable pathways to opportunity for, and 5, maybe as we do that, we think beyond access and to success. So I just want to share some thoughts. First, we're so pleased to partner with NCID and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Alumni Association with this event, and look forward to continuing the discussion in a bit. I'll share those logistics in a second. Our partners, like our esteemed panelists today, are restless in their commitment to equity and innovation and are pushing our community to advance our public purpose, to open doors and remove barriers in order to take on new perspectives and see challenges from new angles. For us, at Academic Innovation, this is at the heart of what innovation is all about, seeing the world from a new angle, identifying the most critical needs of individuals and communities. Inclusion is innovation. I want to echo something that President Schlissel said earlier today in his opening remarks, that U of M's breadth and depth of intellectual resources provides a unique opportunity and responsibility to help address society's most important problems. As we've discussed today, there are very real challenges to this work. There are barriers that exist in the academy that we need to continue to acknowledge and address. Problems of great magnitude, as Mary Jo pointed out, require engagement from problem solvers at all levels and multi-directional learning opportunities that places value on expertise from inside and also well beyond the academy. To fulfill our mission, we need a more expansive and inclusive view. At Academic Innovation, we've been thinking a lot about the following question and challenge in particular. As we advance public engagement, how should we think about activating public concern and encouraging a multi-directional exchange of knowledge and information? Like many of you, I believe, as further evidence from today's discussion, that it's only through meaningful multi-directional engagement that we strengthen the U of M community and increase the power of our collective potential in pursuing new discoveries and greater understanding. This engagement should be guided by the belief that knowledge is created in different ways, using different means, by different people, including those outside of the academy. Today's event is an indication of the commitments the University of Michigan has made to academic innovation, public engagement, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. These mission-aligned investments, as we have heard today, can, should, and do fit together. By aligning missions and efforts around these presidential areas of focus, there is great potential for our communities to learn from each other and build on each other's work to collectively move towards a more socially just future. As we create a sustainable model for facilitating inclusive problem-solving communities, we'll create a compassionate public square that inspires people to learn together from each other and in the interest of solving problems that stand in the way of our preferred future. An institution that effectively listens to and connects with communities around the world can learn the most from it. The compassionate public square we build, shaped by an unwavering commitment to DE&I and public engagement, is a vast and virtuous space where creativity, comprehensive academic excellence, and our aspirations for societal impact all come together to shape the world. We can see plainly that simply transmitting knowledge from the academy to society is insufficient. In a world of near limitless access to knowledge and with communication and learning tools that are improving every day, we can easily look past the critical path challenge. We have not yet sufficiently removed barriers or opened doors wide enough to ensure that the voices that are both present and powerful in our problem-solving communities are representative of society. Once we do, we will construct knowledge, disseminate research, and accelerate application and impact in a way that truly combats injustice and illuminates a pathway to our preferred future. So now for the logistics. This is just one of the many conversations we'll continue to have on the interconnection with DE&I and public engagement. Invite all of you to continue the conversation today by joining us for the second half of the event, starting at 3:45, long break, in the Great Lakes room next door. As you'll note in your program, there will be several tabletop discussions led by colleagues across the institution on important topics where we'd love your thinking and perspectives. There'll be maps as you enter the room, so you can find the discussion group you would like to participate in. Seating is first come, first served, so please feel free to join the table of whatever topic you're most interested in discussing today. One more time, with feeling, thank you to our panel for this afternoon and this great discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Be well and go blue.
Thank you. That was great. Oh, yes, no, it was thank you. It was a great discussion. Really enjoyed being in this with you.